The common room of the Swan and Cross had 40 candles, all of them burning, and for the first time in 18 months, none of them were Cecily's to account for. She stood in the doorway from the back passage with a ledger still tucked beneath her arm, her fingers ink-stained at the second knuckle. A smudge at her jaw she had not noticed, and she looked at the man seated at the corner table and thought, very distinctly, that she did not know him, had not seen his name in the arrivals book. And yet somehow the shape of him. Still, road coat dark against the chair back, a folded paper held loosely between two fingers, already belonged to the room in a way that most guests never managed in 3 days. It was the 4th of November, a Tuesday, and the Bath Road had swallowed 4 carriages in the mud between Tiverton Cross and the milestone at the Pike. 3 of those carriages were accounted for. Their occupants were in the upper rooms demanding more coals, or in the stable arguing about their horses. The 4th carriage had broken a wheel clean off its axle at the turning by the old orchard, and its single passenger had walked the half-mile to the Swan and Cross in the dark, and the rain, and arrived without complaint, left his wet coat with Thomas the boy, and sat down at the corner table with a glass of the small porter, as though he had been expected. Mrs. Galt had come to find Cecily in the accounts room 10 minutes ago, her face wearing an expression Cecily could not immediately read, not displeasure, which she knew well, but something adjacent to calculation. "The gentleman in the corner has paid his own room," Mrs. Galt said, and then she set a folded receipt on top of Cecily's ledger. "He has also paid the Vane debt in full. £120. Cecily had seen that number so often in the past 18 months that it had acquired a texture in her mind, a specific weight, like a stone she had been carrying in her pocket so long she had ceased to feel the bruise of it. She looked at the receipt. The sum was correct. The date was today's. Mrs. Galt's own seal was at the bottom. "He asked that you be brought to him," Mrs. Galt said, and then to the coachman's wife who was watching from the other end of the hallway. "The ledger girl will manage it." The coachman's wife nodded as though that explained something. Cecily walked into the common room. The man at the corner table did not stand when she approached, which she noted not as rudeness but as a particular kind of economy. The move of someone who had done enough standing in ceremonial contexts that they had stopped performing it when the room was half empty. He was perhaps 34. His coat was good broadcloth, very plain, very expensive, the collar high and dry at last. Dark hair, a strong jaw, the face of a man accustomed to thinking before speaking. He looked at her. "Miss Vane," he said. His voice was level, not warm, not cold. A voice that had been trained by some long discipline to give nothing away in its first word. She had not told him her name. "You have the advantage of me," she said, and sat down across from him without being invited, because the ledger was still under her arm, and she intended to be useful if this was a business conversation, and dignified if it was not. He set the receipt on the table between them. "Your father was James Vane. He had a practice in Tiverton. He died in April of last year. His creditors took the furniture." He said these things without flourish, as though they were simply accurate, and accuracy was what the moment required. "Mrs. Galt holds the remainder of his obligations. She has applied that remainder to your continued employment here." "That is correct," Cecily said. "I have paid it," he said. "The debt is extinguished. You have no further obligation to Mrs. Galt beyond the terms of any employment you freely choose to continue." She looked at the receipt. She looked at him. The candles between them were half burned, and the room smelled of wet wool and road dust, and somewhere beneath that, the faint clean scent of a good soap. His, she supposed. He had found a moment to clean himself before sitting down. "Why?" she said. He looked at her for a moment, not a quick sweep, not an appraisal of the obvious kind, but the kind of look that was trying to locate something specific. "I do not know yet," he said. "I would like to know your name." She considered this. "You already know my name," she said. "Miss Vane." "Your given name," he said. And the phrasing was so plain, so level, so entirely without the particular cadence of men who asked things they did not mean, that she answered without deciding to. "Cecily," she said. He nodded once. He reached for the porter. He did not smile. She did not know what she had agreed to by answering, if she had agreed to anything at all. And she picked up the ledger and returned to the accounts room and sat for a long time listening to the inn settle around her, the distant sound of horses, the rain on the window, and the tick of her father's silver watch on the shelf above the desk. If you have ever held your breath in a room you did not know was dangerous, you will understand the feeling that settled over Cecily Vane in the days that followed. A comment or a like, if this is how stories begin for you too, will keep her company. His name in the arrivals book was Edmund Cavendish. He sent no letters the first day, received none, and spent the morning hours in the stable yard looking over his horse. The animal had thrown a shoe in the mud, which explained 3 more days of necessary residence. He was polite to Thomas. He was correct with the chambermaids. He spoke to Mrs. Galt precisely enough to prevent offense, and not a syllable more. Cecily watched him the way she had learned to watch everyone in 18 months of running someone else's inn, not with attention, but with peripheral awareness. The note-taking that happened before the conscious mind had named what it was cataloging. He read in the evenings. He walked out in the mornings regardless of weather. He ate what was set before him without complaint or extravagance. When Mrs. Galt told him the inn's private parlor was unavailable for his exclusive use, he said, "Very well," and continued eating. He had not, since the first night, asked her anything at all. This was, Cecily noticed, a very specific kind of restraint. She had her father's watch wound on the shelf above the accounts desk, and she could hear it from the corridor whenever she passed. James Vane had carried it for 30 years, had wound it each morning without thinking, and she had taken on the habit as though the habit itself were a form of keeping him present. The creditors had wanted the watch. She had told them it had been lost in the removal of the furniture, which was a lie. And she had been ashamed of the lie for 3 weeks, and had since made peace with it. Some things were not negotiable. On the second afternoon, Mr. Silas Rook arrived on the yard from the Tiverton Market Road, and Cecily, who was tallying the coal delivery at the back entrance, heard his voice before she saw him. "Is the ledger girl about?" Rook said to the ostler. He said it comfortably, easily, the way people say things they have said so often they no longer hear themselves saying them. 2 grooms looked up from the horse they were harnessing. The ostler tilted his head toward the back door. Rook's voice carried in the cold air the specific confidence of a man who had decided that the world owed him a response. She came out because she would not give him the pleasure of making her stay in. Rook was red-faced, well-fed, 45, a horse dealer of the kind that wore his prosperity like a judgment on everyone around him. He had been making his interest known to Mrs. Galt for 2 months, speaking always of Cecily as a practical proposition, the debt cleared, a house provided, an inconvenient situation resolved. He had not spoken to Cecily directly about it. He had spoken around her as though she were a parcel whose opinion of its destination was not relevant. "I've heard Mrs. Galt had a windfall," he said to Cecily pleasantly. "Unexpected settlement of old accounts." "The inn's accounts are the inn's business," she said. "Your father's accounts," he said, still pleasant, "which were very much your business, if you follow me." He looked past her at the inn as though pricing it. "I had an arrangement in mind," Still do. I have no arrangement in mind, she said. The offer stands, he said. You may want it, by and by. She went back inside. She thought, as she walked back through the passage, that Rook was the kind of man who had never had to become anyone because the world had always provided him with a category and a place inside it. He was a horse dealer. Horse dealers of his particular type acquired useful things and managed them. He had decided she was a useful thing, and he was not troubled by her opinion of the classification, because in his experience, the opinion of a useful thing was not a relevant variable. She had met her father's creditors. She knew this type precisely. They were not cruel the way deliberate people were cruel. They simply did not notice. He was at the foot of the back stairs when she came through the passage. He had clearly just come in from his morning walk, his coat still cold from the air. He was perhaps 4 steps above her, which put their faces at a level. She stopped on the bottom step. He looked at her. That specific look again, the one that appeared to be locating something, and said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. He did not look convinced, and he did not press it. And he stepped aside for her on the stairs, and the sleeve of his coat brushed her shoulder as she passed, and she felt the warmth of him through the fabric, a simple physical fact that her body registered with a precision her mind was not ready to discuss. She did not look back. The sick postboy arrived on the 3rd day, which was a Thursday. His name was William. He was perhaps 16, and he had ridden hard in the cold and arrived at the Swan and Cross Gate at 8:30 with a fever that had clearly been building since the morning. The surgeon was away at a confinement 6 miles down the Tiverton Road. Mrs. Galt looked at the boy and looked at Cecily and went to bed. Because Mrs. Galt's nights were her own once the candles were snuffed. Cecily put the boy in the small side room off the kitchen, which was warmer than the stables and quieter than the common rooms. She worked the apothecary tin from the shelf. Willow bark, dried chamomile, a preparation the village woman had taught her. Nothing certain, but everything available. She compressed cold cloths, changed them, sat with the boy because sitting with the boy was what the moment required, and because no one else was there to do it. She read to him from a small volume she kept in her coat pocket, a collection of natural observations, English birds and their seasonal patterns. She did not know whether he heard her. She thought the sound of a voice might be its own kind of medicine. At some point the lamp was refilled without her touching it. She had been reading for perhaps 2 hours, her voice low and steady, the boy's breathing gradually becoming less labored and more even. She had described the migration of the swift, the winter habits of the fieldfare, the way certain thrushes return to the same hedgerow in successive years with such consistent fidelity that naturalists had learned to recognize individuals by their habits rather than their markings. She had not chosen the passage deliberately. She had simply read what came next, and what came next happened to be about constancy. At some point, the fire in the kitchen grate had been made up, which she also had not done. She did not hear him go. She only knew, in the particular way one knows the presence of another person in a room without sight or sound to confirm it, that someone had been present and was no longer, and that the lamp and the fire were the evidence of the visit, and that he had not wished to be discovered performing it. She noticed this only when she finally looked up and found it full when it should have been guttering. And then she noticed that the corridor door was not precisely as she had left it, slightly wider, as though someone had stood there and then gone carefully away. The surgeon arrived at 6:30 in the morning. She had not sent for him. He told her a gentleman at the inn had ridden out in the night. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the corridor door, and something shifted in her chest that she did not yet have a name for. Something warm and inconvenient, and not entirely welcome. Because she had spent 18 months learning to want only what was available to her, and this was not. He was at breakfast in the common room when she came through. She stopped at his table. "You sent for the surgeon," she said. He looked up from his plate. "The boy needed one." "He did," she said. "Thank you." He nodded. He looked at the book she still had in her pocket. "What were you reading to him?" "English birds," she said. "The seasonal patterns." Something in his face shifted. Very small, barely a movement. And he said, "My wife read to me the night I had a fever. The same kind of book. Something about migration." He said it without apparent weight, the way people say things they have stopped protecting. Then he looked back at his plate. "Sit down, Miss Vane. You have been up all night." It was a command, not an invitation. She sat down. And that is how it began properly. Not with the money, and not with the asking of her name, but with a book about birds, and a command from a man who did not know yet that he was issuing them with something that had been broken in him since the autumn of 1812. The story that came out over the next 2 days was not told all at once. Mr. Cavendish, as she still thought of him, as the book still named him, said things in pieces, the way a building yields its secrets not in a sudden demolition, but in a slow settling, one stone at a time. He said them without sentimentality, and she heard them without pretending she was not listening. He had a seat in Parliament, which he had held for 6 years, without particular distinction, and with a great deal of quiet work. He had been in London in the autumn of 1812, when Eleanor, his wife, her name said once plainly, Eleanor, with a particular quality of care around the syllables, had labored early. The letter from the house had reached him a day after she was gone. He had arrived to find the house quiet in a way he had not been able to describe to anyone since, a quality of silence that was different from any silence he had previously encountered. "I blamed the distance," he said. "Then I blamed myself for the distance. Then I blamed the nature of the work that kept me there, which was merely another way of blaming myself." He was looking at the window when he said this, not at her. "Last year I found a letter she had written the week before. I had not opened it." He stopped. Cecily waited. "It was not what I expected," he said. "That is all." He reached into his breast pocket and placed his hand flat over it for a moment, a gesture so small she might not have noticed it if she had not been watching. Something was folded there. He did not produce it. She thought of the silver watch on the shelf above the accounts desk, and said nothing, which was the correct response. And he seemed to know it was, because he looked at her briefly with that locating expression, and then went back to his tea. They sat in a quiet that was not uncomfortable. The common room was otherwise empty at that hour, the breakfast service over, the midday still 2 hours away. Outside the window, the Bath Road was visible in the pale November light, a cart passing slowly with a load of timber. "You keep the accounts for this house," he said, not as a question. "I do," she said. "Your father taught you." "He taught me to read a ledger before I could read a novel," she said. "He said numbers were more honest than words. Words could be made to say almost anything. Numbers only ever said one thing." He looked at her with an expression she had begun to associate with those moments when she said something he had not expected. Not surprise exactly. He was not a man who showed surprise, but a particular quality of attention, as though he were revising something. "He was right," he said, "about numbers." "Not always," she said. "Numbers can be arranged to lie. You simply need to know which ones to move." She looked at the accounts ledger she had brought with her out of habit. My father discovered that. Late and at considerable cost. He did not press it. He simply received the information and placed it alongside whatever else he had gathered, and the gesture of receiving without pressing was, she was finding, one of the things she trusted about him, and she was not entirely comfortable with how many such things there now were. That evening she wound the watch in the accounts room and heard him in the corridor and did not call out, and he did not knock, and the space between the closed door and his presence on the other side of it was the most charged thing in the building. The commands had accumulated by then without either of them naming the pattern. Come inside, the second morning. When she was standing in the rain assessing a blocked drain, she had come inside. Eat something. The afternoon after the surgeon's visit. When she had been in the accounts room since 7, and it was nearly 2. She had eaten. Leave Rook's man to Thomas the third time Rook's agent had come to the yard with questions about the debt receipt. She had left him to Thomas. Each command was syntactically dominant and functionally protective, and she had known both things simultaneously each time, and the knowing had produced in her that inconvenient warmth she had still not named, the one that lived just below the sternum and rose when he was in the room, and subsided when he was not. There were smaller things that did not rise to the level of commands. The morning he had carried the heavy ledger box from the store cupboard to the accounts room without being asked, setting it down with the care of someone who had noted where it belonged and where she customarily reached for it. The afternoon he had stood at the accounts room doorway for a full minute, she had seen his shadow under the door, and then moved away without knocking, and she had not been able to determine whether he had intended to say something and thought better of it, or whether he had simply wanted to know she was there. She told herself he was a man of methodical habits, and that a coaching in with no other guests of his station provided limited entertainment. She told herself it with more consistency than conviction. Her body, as noted, was not consulting her on the matter. The warmth persisted regardless of the explanation she offered for it. She told herself this was gratitude. Her body was not consulting her on the matter. On the 5th evening, Lady Priscilla Ford's traveling party came through the inn. It was bad timing of a very specific kind. Lady Priscilla was young, very beautiful, very composed, arriving in a carriage that made the Swan and Crosses yard feel provincial in a way it had not felt before. She required the private parlor. She received it. Her maid required the best guest room. She received it. Everything was done with a polish that made Cecily conscious, in a way she was rarely permitted to be, of the smudge she likely still carried at her jaw and the ink on her second knuckle, and the fact that her gown was the better of her two, and still showed its age at the cuffs. It was Lady Priscilla's maid who delivered the note. She crossed the common room with the small folded square held in 2 fingers, as though it were a calling card at a proper house, and placed it in front of Mr. Cavendish at the corner table with the precision of someone who had delivered exactly this kind of message many times before. "From my lady," she said, "for Viscount Hartwell." The room did not stop, but something in it shifted. Mrs. Galt, who had been at the linen cupboard in the corridor behind the common room door, stepped into the doorframe. Cecily was at the accounts table in the alcove. Mr. Rook, who had come back that afternoon on the pretext of asking about a horse, was leaning against the bar. He looked at the note. Then he looked at Cecily. His face was entirely composed and entirely giving nothing away, except that the composure itself was a kind of answer. He took the note. He did not open it. Mrs. Galt's calculation happened visibly in the half-second compression of her expression from curiosity to something colder. "A Viscount," she said, to no one in particular. And then, to Cecily, quietly, in the way she had of making quiet things land like decisions. He paid that debt as sport. A man of that quality has an estate and a mother and arrangements already made. You have seen Lady Priscilla. You understand what that means." Cecily did understand. She had understood it from the first moment without letting herself look at it directly. Rook crossed the room. He placed his hands on the accounts table in a way that was meant to establish something. "I have an arrangement that does not require a title," he said. "The receipt Mrs. Galt countersigned. I'll take it as part of the settlement, and we'll say no more about the £120, or what was behind it. Simple as that." He said it as though her answer were already decided, and he was simply waiting for her to notice. The ledger girl has had her adventure. Time to be practical. Cecily looked at him. She looked at the accounts table. She looked at the corridor, where she knew he had gone with the note in his hand. She reached into her apron pocket and found the small silver penknife he had left on the table 2 evenings ago when he had helped her with the stuck ink seal. She held it out to Thomas, who was closest. "Return this to Mr. Cavendish's room," she said. Her voice was level, precise. "With my thanks." She went to the accounts room and closed the door, and sat in the chair, and looked at her father's watch on the shelf until she could breathe without it being difficult. The watch ticked. She counted the ticks. The thing was that she had known. She had known on the first night, when Mrs. Galt said his name was in the book as Cavendish and nothing further. A man who traveled without the cushion of his title was either running from it or resting it, and she had assumed resting because it was easier to assume resting. She had told herself that a man who paid £120 for a stranger's freedom and asked for her given name was simply kind, as some men were kind, as her father had been kind in the particular way that had also driven him into debt. Kindness was not intention. Kindness was not choice. And a viscount did not choose a woman who ran an inn's accounts with ink on her fingers. He chose Lady Priscilla Ford, who arrived in the correct carriage with the correct maid, and the correct composure, and the correct number of social connections, and who sent notes addressed to the correct title. This was not bitterness. It was arithmetic. She picked up the watch and held it, and heard the tick of it against her palm, and thought of her father's hands, which had been square and ink-stained in the same way hers were, and thought that he would have said, as he said about most difficult things, that the numbers did not change, because you did not like them. She put the watch down. She opened the ledger. She did not cry, because crying required a belief that the situation was worse than expected, and she had not permitted herself to expect. It was not grief, exactly. It was more accurate than grief. It was the specific sensation of having almost believed something for 6 days and then becoming correct again. If you have stayed this far, you know what is coming. You know, and you are right. And the knowing does not make it smaller. She was in the yard at 7:30 the next morning, because the coal delivery had been miscounted on Thursday, and the carter was expected back, and she was the one who handled discrepancies in the coal delivery, as she was the one who handled most things that required arithmetic and a steady expression. The morning was cold, clear for the first time in a week, and the market day crowd was beginning to gather at the gate where the road widened. 3 coachmen were on the yard, 2 ostlers. Mrs. Galt on the inn steps with her arms folded. Rook's agent, a small man named Cleaver, who smelled of horses and spoke in shorthand, was explaining that Mr. Rook had a particular view about the debt receipt and would Cecily be available to discuss it this morning. She was about to say that she would not. She heard the inn's back door open behind her. She did not turn. She did not need to. The sound of his boot on the cobble was by now as familiar as the tick of her father's watch. Edmund Cavendish walked across the yard, 3 strides, unhurried, past the water trough and the near ostler and a coachman who stepped aside without being asked and placed himself between Cecily and Mr. Cleaver. He was not wearing the road coat. He was in his best coat, the one he had not worn since the first evening. Dark blue, fitted, the collar white and exact. He had the debt receipt in his left hand and a sealed document she did not recognize in his right. He looked at Cleaver. Then he looked at Rook, who had materialized at the yard gate in the last 30 seconds. He looked at Mrs. Galt on the steps. He looked at Cecily. She thought she had prepared herself for whatever this was. She found she had not. "Her name," he said, and his voice was level and carried in the cold air without any effort at volume, "is Miss Vane, and she is promised to me." The words carried as though the cold air had been waiting for them. No one moved. Mrs. Galt's hand had been at the brooch at her collar. It stopped. Rook took one step forward and then did not take another, which was the most accurate response he had ever produced. Cleaver looked at the sealed document Edmund was holding, and then at his employer, and then at the cobbles. A solicitor, Cecily saw him now, arriving on foot from the road, a man she did not know, a man who had clearly been summoned, came through the yard gate and stood at Edmund's elbow. He produced a receipt of his own. "The debt instrument has been transferred to Miss Vane directly," the solicitor said, in the way solicitors say things when they have been paid well, to be clear. "She holds it as a free discharge. No further claims can be made against her person or circumstances under this note." Rook looked at Edmund for a long moment. Edmund did not look back at Rook. He was looking at Cecily. She became aware that she was standing very still in the center of the yard, with the entire morning market attendants at the gate, and the coachman on the yard, and Mrs. Galt on the steps, and the solicitor to one side, and an ostler who had stopped moving his pitchfork, all of them watching. She was aware of the cold air on her face, the cobbles under her feet, the particular smell of the yard in winter, horse and straw, and the iron smell of the frost on the stone trough. She was aware of all of this with the heightened clarity that arrives when something has just shifted irrevocably, when the world has resorted itself and the new arrangement is becoming visible. She was the center of it, and she was not afraid, which told her something about the specific source of her steadiness, standing 3 feet from her in a blue coat. She was aware that her hands were perfectly steady. "You did not leave," she said. Her voice was low, precise. "No," he said. He was close enough now that she did not need to be loud. "You sent the penknife back," she said. "I know," he said. "I should not have let you send it." There was a pause that was not awkward. It was the opposite of awkward. It was the kind of pause that 2 people arrive at when something real has been said and they are giving it the space it needs. "I do not know how to be the thing you are promising," she said. "I run an inn's accounts. I have one good gown." "I know what I am promising," he said. And then, more quietly, "And I know your name. You told me the first night. I have not misplaced it." The cold air moved between them. She thought of the watch on the shelf. She thought of her father's ledger, the first one, the one he had taught her to keep when she was 9 years old, and her mother was still alive, and the whole of the debt had not yet been conceived. She thought of 16 months of nights in the accounts room, the candle down to its socket, the numbers adding to the same wrong answer. She thought of a book about birds and a door not knocked upon, and a surgeon arriving at 6:30 in the morning. "Yes," she said. Not loudly, not dramatically. The word landed in the cold air and stayed there, specific and final, and his composure moved, fractionally, genuinely, the way stone moves when the frost finally releases it, and something in his face arrived at an expression she did not have a name for, but recognized as the end of a very long winter. Behind her she heard Mrs. Galt turn and go inside. She heard Rook say something short to Cleaver, and the sound of them moving toward the gate. She heard the coachman nearest them resume his work with the deliberate industry of a man who had decided he had seen nothing worth discussing. The solicitor presented the papers. Edmund signed. He handed the pen to Cecily. She signed beside him on the line, her handwriting very small and very exact. The way she had learned to write in the tight columns of a ledger, where economy of space was a virtue. She folded the discharge document. She put it in her apron pocket, next to the space where the penknife had been. A month later, the house at the edge of the Hartwell village was lit in the morning, which was a thing it had not been for 4 years. It was not a grand house. It had a study and a kitchen garden and a window above the parlor that looked toward the estate woods, and it had 2 fires that were usually both lit, and it had the particular quality of warmth that a house produces when it has recently been occupied by people who intend to remain. Cecily was at the small desk in the study because she had asked Edmund's steward for the household accounts a week ago, and had found 3 entries in the summer quarter that wanted reconciling. The steward had been grateful in the way that people are grateful when they have been quietly anxious about something, and have not said so. The silver watch was on the shelf above the desk. She wound it each morning without thinking, the way her father had. Edmund was in the chair by the window, with a report from London that he appeared to be reading, and also not reading. In the way he sometimes read things when he was thinking about something else. He had his hand on the breast pocket of his coat, the gesture she had come to know as his way of steadying himself, the folded letter still there, which he had opened, and which was now his to carry, rather than his to dread. He had told her, in December, what Eleanor's letter had said. He had not read it aloud. He had described it in his particular careful way, that it was written in love, that it named nothing as his failure, that it had said she was not afraid. He had said this in the way he said things that cost him, plainly, as though plainness was the only courtesy an important thing deserved. She had not offered comfort in words. She had put her hand on his, briefly, on the study table, and he had turned his hand over and held it, and that was all, and it had been sufficient. The watch ticked on the shelf. Outside the window, the first snow of the year was considering itself. A few flakes, tentative. The air just cold enough to let them fall without melting. The woods were bare and gray and very still. Edmund looked up from the report and found her watching the snow. He looked at her the way he had learned to look at her, with that quality of attention she had first noticed in the common room of the Swan and Cross on the 4th of November, the attention of a man who had decided that seeing a person accurately was more valuable than any other thing he possessed. "The South Pasture accounts need a 3rd entry from August," she said, without looking away from the snow. "They do," he said. The steward transposed the figures. "He did," he said. She looked at him. He was almost smiling. Not quite. It was the particular almost smile she had come to know, the one that appeared in very limited circumstances when something pleased him that he had not expected to be pleased by. And she had learned, without letting herself say so, that appearing in his vicinity was apparently one of those circumstances with some regularity. "You knew," she said. "I suspected," he said. "I thought you might prefer to find it yourself." She turned back to the ledger, which was perfectly true. Outside, the snow had committed to itself. Not a storm, a quiet, considered snowfall, the kind that covered the world in 2 inches, and then stopped and let everything stay clean for a day. The estate woods were very white against the gray sky. The kitchen garden was a white square. The path from the gate to the door was already smoothing over. She had walked that path for the first time in the 3rd week of November, when the solicitor had come with the papers, and Edmund had said quietly, over the signed documents, that there was a house at the edge of the village that had been sitting empty, and that he thought she might want to see it before any other arrangements were made. He had said it carefully, with the same precision he brought to everything that mattered to him, not assuming her answer, and not pushing toward it. She had seen the study first. The shelf above the desk, which was the right height and the right depth for a watch. She had said yes to the house before she had finished saying it to the other question, and she thought her father would have recognized that particular order of priorities and been pleased by it. The watch ticked. The snow fell. The fire in the east grate made its small, warm sound. She wrote the corrected entry in her careful hand, and thought of all the nights in the accounts room at the Swan and Cross with the candle burning low, and the numbers adding to the same wrong answer every time she checked them, and thought that this was what it felt like when the answer finally came right. Not loud, not sudden, but this. A study in a small house on a clear December morning, and a man across the room who had asked for her name, and had not, in all the time since, misplaced it. Thank you for staying with Cecily to the end. If her story settled something in you, leave a word in the comments. She would appreciate the company.